In this series on enhancing local print contrast, I've showed just how powerful print flashing can be. I often use just an overall pre-flash, and it works really great. But what if you want more control out of the process? Well, I'm gonna show you how to get that control in this video. Usually when we're flashing a print, we're trying to tame dense negative highlights. And this method is very effective. However, you do lose a bit of overall contrast in the process. Proportionally, a lot less in the shadows, but it's an overall loss nonetheless. To overcome this, what we can do is just flash the print where the dense negative highlights are. This is called targeted or localized flashing, and you can accomplish this in a few different ways. The first way would be to mark areas around your easel, basically making kind of a coordinate grid showing you where you want to make the flash. This is going to give you the general area of where you want to make your exposure. Then before the main image exposure, stop down the lens and pull the negative carrier from the enlarger. Then give the pre-flash with the non-image forming light. Alternatively, you could use some type of diffusion under the enlarger, and that would allow you to leave the negative in the carrier. The downside to this method is that it can be difficult to get super accurate with it. Another way to do this would be to use like a flashing tool of some kind, maybe like a pen light that can be focused, or something like the flasher that I made works quite well. I'll put a link in the description to that video. In this instance, you would swing the red safety filter in front of the lens, protecting the paper from being exposed. And this will allow you to accurately see the image and let you add that non-image pre-flash selectively. I find you can be pretty accurate, but the downside to this is it can be really difficult to test and get the times just right. Now, if you have a negative that has multiple areas of dense highlights, you might want to consider making a mask for flashing these areas. This method combines inkjet masking and pre-flashing. I had previously made videos on both of these topics in the series, and I have a link to them in the description below. With an inkjet mask, what we can do is mask off all the areas except for the highlights, effectively giving us like a targeted pre-flash. On this negative, what I did was selected the blown out clouds, inverted the selection, and filled that area with red. When printed out, this will block the light from the midtones and the shadows. Next, I put this in register with my negative and taped a punch leader to the mask. This way I can pull it in and out the negative carrier, and it will stay perfectly aligned where the negative was. Now you need to be able to register in the enlarger as accurately as you can, so you'll need to make some type of guide or marks as to where the carrier needs to sit. I do use the pin registered carrier by Lynn Radecka, and I absolutely love it, but you can definitely make and use this type of mask with the negative carrier that I made in the previous video. And again, there will be a link to all those videos in the description. I have successfully printed with that same build for years before upgrading to the one that I currently have. So luckily with this type of mask, we're using non-image forming light, so the registration doesn't have to be perfect. You just want it as close as you can get it, and if needed, you could also widen the flash area on the mask. Now I make the pre-flash with the inkjet mask and diffusion material only, no negative. This will bring down the contrast of the highlights and not affect the shadows or midtones at all. Then I pull the mask and make a second exposure with the negative in the carrier in registration with the first exposure. The downside to this method is it's a bit time consuming. You need to make pre-flash test exposures for every different size print that you make. So to test for those pre-flash exposures, you're gonna make a test strip under your enlarger. You need to stop down your lens to dim the light, and I also used neutral density filters under my lens and more diffusion material in the negative carrier if needed. I set the filter on my variable contrast head to the lowest setting or the softest filter setting because I'm specifically targeting the highlights. When you're making the test strip, put a piece of transparency film, the same film you use to actually print the mask, in the negative carrier on top of the diffusion. That way you'll get an accurate exposure just as if the mask was in there. Then make a series of 1 second exposures, develop, stop, fix, and dry. The step just before any slight density change is the exposure you want to use. In my case, it was 2 1 second exposures. Once that's determined, it's just really a matter of making the pre-flash exposure with the Dodge mask in place. then removing it and replacing it with the original negative, stopping the lens back down, changing the filter, and giving it the original exposure. This method will give you very precise pre-flashes, and it's particularly handy with smaller negatives when more precise masking is just not feasible. Now, if you want to do this method completely in the darkroom and just stay off your computer, you can. You can make a highlight separation mask using that exact same pin registered carrier. What this does, it creates a high contrast positive where you give exposure through the midtones, but not in the highlights, leaving them absolutely blank on the film. And with a high contrast lithographic film like the one from Arista and a high contrast developer like Ansco 22, you can really get a split where it blocks up right up until the shadows and the midtones will all block up and be opaque, and then the highlights will stay clear. The recipe for Ansco 22, I did add this to my Darkroom formula ebook, which you can get for free in the description. So take a piece of 5x7 film, punch it with the 2-hole punch, and then contact print that in the negative carrier below the enlarger. And you're gonna wanna make sure you put black paper underneath the negative in film as well. So your times are gonna definitely vary from mine, and you'll need to do some testing for your setup. But the mask I made here was at 8 seconds at f16 and then developed for 1 minute in the Ansco 22. Everything up to the highlights can be blocked up by this separation mask, making it easy to flash or in some cases even print down the highlights. You can also bleach and marker off areas as needed to make things more opaque or more open for your mask. So these are just a few ways to get more targeted with your pre-flashing and get more precise with your printing. This gives a lot of control over your local contrast, and that's what this series of videos is all about. These can be time consuming, but when needed, they work incredibly well. Till next time.